Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a concept that's, well, it's less of a formal geopolitical doctrine and more of a psychological framework.
A fear template, you could almost call it.
Exactly. A fear template that really, truly drove U.S. foreign policy for half a century. We are, of course, talking about the domino theory.
It is, I think, maybe the most powerful and enduring political metaphor of the entire Cold War.
I'd agree with that.
I mean, the image is just so simple and devastatingly effective, isn't it? A row of dominoes standing up and a political shift or, a failure in just one country will inevitably trigger this cascade, a collapse in all its neighbors.
It's such a visceral image, and our mission today is to really unpack that idea in all its complexity. We want to go beyond the simple definition, look at its origins in the early days of containment,
Right.
Analyze how it was used to justify massive interventions, Vietnam being the obvious one, and then I think most importantly, critically assess whether history actually validated this fear.
Or if it was, as a lot of people now argue, just a catastrophic and incredibly costly miscalculation.
So to set the stage, we have to start with the moment the metaphor really exploded into the public consciousness.
Yeah, we do. And while the idea was floating around before him, it was President Dwight D. Eisenhower who really popularized it.
At that news conference, right. April 7, 1954.
That's the one. He was talking specifically about the situation in French Indochina, where, French colonial control was just rapidly collapsing.
And that quote, it's required reading for anyone studying this period.
It really is. He said, you have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly.
The certainty. There's no ambiguity there.
None. He goes on, so you could have a beginning of a disintegration that would have the most profound influences. It's just a perfect distillation of that era's worldview.
It suggests that geopolitics operates like physics.
Exactly. Like there are these immutable laws.
Yeah.
A chain reaction where losing one piece makes losing the next one completely inevitable.
So for the U.S. administration at the time, this wasn't just about, losing some small country in Southeast Asia.
Oh, not at all. It was about the entire continent, the whole Pacific region facing this systemic, irreversible threat. The stakes they were playing for were regional and global, not just local.
Okay, so let's unpack this fear. To really get the domino theory, we have to go back to that seismic shift in global power right after World War II. The year is 1945. What was in the air? What defined those anxieties that made this collapse model so terrifying?
Well, the foundational anxiety was just the realization that the post-war settlement involved this massive, sudden, and seemingly unstoppable expansion of Soviet influence.
It happened so fast.
Incredibly fast. After 1945, the Soviet Union used its military presence to just systematically bring most of Eastern and Central Europe under its heel. And this wasn't just a suggestion, it was a direct ideological, military, and territorial challenge to the democratic West.
And that expansion leads us directly to that defining speech, the one that really drew the line in the sand, the Iron Curtain moment.
Exactly. March 1946. Winston Churchill is speaking in Fulton, Missouri, of all places, and he delivers a speech that basically maps out the start of the Cold War.
An Iron Curtain has descended across the continent.
And he was so specific about what had been lost. He starts naming these key capitals now trapped behind it. Warsaw, Prague, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, Sofia.
These ancient, proud cities.
Ancient, proud capitals, now subject, as he argued, to absolute control from Moscow behind a line that ran from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic.
So the map of this ideological collapse was already there. It was drawn. The question for the West then became, how do we stop it from spreading?
Right.
But who in U.S. policy was the first to really articulate this mechanism, this idea of things falling one after the other?
Well, you'd have to give that credit to President Harry S. Truman. The concept of the domino effect was really the core rationale behind what became the Truman Doctrine in 1947.
He used it to justify aid.
Right. He explicitly invoked this danger of successive collapse to justify sending a huge amount of financial and military aid to two countries in particular.
Greece and Turkey.
Greece and Turkey. Greece was in the middle of a civil war against communist insurgents, and Turkey was facing immense Soviet pressure to allow bases near its straits.
And the Truman Doctrine was just. It was revolutionary. It's the moment the United States basically throws out its long tradition of isolationism.
Oh, it's a monumental pivot. It completely changes America's role in the world. Truman says it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who were resisting attempted subjugation.
By armed minorities or by outside pressures.
Exactly. And the underlying fear, that unspoken domino fear, was that if Greece falls,
Turkey is next.
then Iran, maybe Italy. And before you know it, the entire Middle East and Southern Europe are lost. The aid was an inoculation, a vaccine against contagion.
And this action was backed up by an intellectual framework provided by the diplomat George Kennan, a man who saw the Soviet threat as ideological, not just military.
Yes, Kennan's X article, which he had published anonymously in Foreign Affairs in July of 47, that's what gave us the doctrine of containment.
Then what was his argument?
Kennan argued that Soviet expansionism was driven by its own internal totalitarian needs, and that the best long-term strategy was, quote, patient but firm and vigilant containment of those expansive tendencies.
But containment wasn't just about stopping invasions, was it? Kennan's point was that the spread of communism was unacceptable even if it happened legally, through democratic means.
That is such a critical point. The ideological competition was everything. Kennan believed the Soviet system was fundamentally flawed and would, eventually collapse from within if the U.S. could just prevent it from expanding externally. So the domino theory in that context wasn't just about stopping Soviet tanks. It was about stopping the prestige of communism from growing.
Because that success could sway elections somewhere else.
Or incite a local revolution. Containment needed a defensive perimeter that was both ideological and territorial.
So if containment is the strategy, then the Marshall Plan has to be the economic tool, the way to build up resilience and stop the dominoes from falling because of poverty and desperation.
100%. The Marshall Plan, or the European Recovery Program, was launched right alongside the Truman Doctrine in 47. It pumped billions of dollars in aid into Western Europe, including, crucially, Greece and Turkey.
And the goal was geopolitical.
Fundamentally, the thinking was that economic stability was the ultimate prophylactic against the communist domino effect. If people have jobs and food, they're less likely to turn to radical ideologies.
But it wasn't just free money, was it? I mean, there were strings attached that served those containment goals.
Oh, absolutely. The funding wasn't a handout. It required the recipients to coordinate their economic policies, to open up their markets, and generally commit to a Western capitalist model.
So by fostering that economic recovery and interdependence with the U.S., it helped make sure they'd stay aligned with the West.
Right. It made them less fragile, less likely to fall prey to internal communist parties or Soviet pressure. The Marshall Plan basically stabilized the economic dominoes that Truman was so afraid would topple.
But while Europe was being shored up, the biggest strategic blow of the early Cold War happens in Asia.
Yeah.
It proved containment was already too late in the East. The loss of China in 1949. This is where that fear really crystallizes into outright panic.
It really is. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communist-backed forces finally defeat the U.S.-supported nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. They established the People's Republic of China.
And to the West, this wasn't just a loss. This was the world's most populous nation. 500 million people overnight turning communist.
It was seen as a geopolitical catastrophe of the highest order. And it immediately sparked this massive, paranoid political inquest in Washington.
Yeah.
Who lost China?
That phrase alone says so much about the American self-perception of power back then.
It does, doesn't it? It implies China was America's to lose. That some kind of blunder in the Truman administration was to blame.
And that political climate, fueled by that question, it just sets the stage for McCarthyism, for extreme anti-communist paranoia.
And for decades of isolating the PRC, the fear was simple. If a giant like China could fall, any of its neighbors were surely doomed.
And then, almost immediately after China falls, we get the Korean conflict.
Right. A direct, hot war that seems to confirm everyone's worst fears.
That communism was aggressively on the march across Asia.
Well, you had the peninsula divided at the 38th parallel, just like Germany. When fighting breaks out in 1950, it wasn't just a civil war. China actively intervenes on the communist side.
And the U.S. leads a coalition of allied countries to defend the South.
Right, and China's intervention especially was seen as proof of this coordinated monolithic communist bloc that was determined to just push containment right back across the Pacific.
It was a huge message from Mao.
A huge message. He saw it as a chance to confront the strongest anti-communist power in the world, the U.S., right when his own new regime was still trying to find its feet.
And by pushing U.S. forces back, he showed the rest of Asia that American power wasn't unchallengeable.
Exactly. He showed that communism was willing and able to fight the U.S. in open conflict. The war ends in 1953 with an armistice, leaving Korea divided. But by then, the strategic template was set.
Communism had spread, it was aggressive, and it demanded military confrontation. The atmosphere was it was ripe for the formal articulation of the domino theory in Asia.
So if Truman was the father of containment, Eisenhower's the one who really tailors the domino metaphor for Asia. He makes it the number one public justification for U.S. interests in the region.
And Southeast Asia becomes the definitive testing ground for the entire idea.
It really does. The trigger event, the one that leads to Eisenhower's famous 1954 speech, was the complete disintegration of French colonial control in Indochina.
Walk us through what happened that year. It was a military and diplomatic whirlwind.
It was. In the spring of 54, the French were just decisively defeated by the Viet Minh. That's the combined communist and nationalist army under Ho Chi Minh at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu.
And this wasn't some minor skirmish.
Oh, no. This was a humiliating, crushing defeat. It signaled the absolute end of French colonial rule in Southeast Asia and created this massive power vacuum.
Which leads directly to the Geneva Conference.
Yep. The global powers try to broker a new deal, and the Geneva Accords wind up dividing French Indochina into 4 independent countries: North Vietnam, under communist control, and then South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. For Washington, the strategic concern was immediate. It was existential. Eisenhower argued that losing Indochina would give communism this major strategic advantage that just could not be allowed to stand.
But his argument wasn't really about Vietnam itself. It was about what was next in line, which piece of the puzzle would be next to fall.
That's the core of it. Eisenhower warned that if Vietnam fell, it would lead to Thailand, then Malaya, then Indonesia, and eventually it would threaten the really critical frontline states farther away.
Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand.
The key allies. The fear wasn't just military. It was that they would be forced to, politically compromise with communism out of economic necessity or just plain fear.
Because they relied so heavily on trade with that whole region.
Exactly. So the threat wasn't necessarily this image of a massive army sweeping south. It was more subtle. It was a shift in political alignment based on the visible success and the prestige of the communist model in Vietnam.
So it was about who the region saw as the inevitable winner in Asia.
It speaks to this profound belief in the power of ideological success. General Douglas MacArthur had this famous line, "Victory is a strong magnet in the East." And policymakers were terrified that a communist victory would exert this overwhelming magnetic pull, drawing all the surrounding nations into its orbit.
And that fear of regional compromise. That is what transforms the domino theory from just an abstract concept into a full-blown justification for war.
It's the primary rationale. The Kennedy and Johnson administrations used it throughout the 1960s to justify ramping up American military involvement in Vietnam.
It was the perfect argument, wasn't it? Morally and strategically.
It was. The logic was simple. If you don't fight here, in this difficult place, you'll have to fight everywhere else later under much worse conditions. And this put President Kennedy in a massive dilemma in the early 60s.
Tell me about Kennedy's tenuous position. What was the specific problem he was facing with South Vietnam?
Well, he was completely committed to containing communism there. That meant he had to support the anti-communist Diem government in the South.
But Diem's government was not today.
It was notoriously authoritarian, corrupt, and deeply unpopular with its own people. So it created this impossible moral and political problem for the U.S.
Which we see play out so visibly in 1963 with the Buddhist protests.
Absolutely. When Buddhist monks started self-immolating in public to protest the Diem regime, those shocking images were broadcast all over the world.
And it made supporting Diem politically toxic back home.
Right. So the U.S. was caught. Do you support this deeply flawed anti-democratic ally as a moral compromise? Or do you risk letting the domino fall to communism, which was seen as the greater catastrophe?
And the fear of contagion won out.
It trumped the desire for political reform. And that focus soon extended beyond Vietnam's borders to prevent any kind of sanctuary for the North. Which brings us to the concerns about Laos.
Laos was critical terrain.
It was. Policymakers worried that the Pathet Lao, a communist-led group there, would provide safe bases and logistical networks for the Viet Cong to infiltrate South Vietnam. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is the physical proof of this.
It ran right through Laos and Cambodia.
Exactly. It was a physical manifestation of the domino concept, showing how the stability of one nation was completely tied to the military capability of another.
And if Laos fell, it didn't just help the Viet Cong. It also created this long, porous border with Thailand,
which threatened the very next domino on the map. Laos was seen as the pivot point. If the communists controlled Laos, they could put immense pressure on Thailand. The whole justification for the massive military commitment in Vietnam was driven by stopping that chain reaction before it could ever start. The theory dictated that the fight had to happen right there, right then, or the cost would be 10 times higher later on.
So now we get to the central question. Was the domino theory right? Was it a correct prediction that was just handled badly, or was it a fundamentally flawed idea from the start? Let's start with the arguments for it. What's the strongest evidence its proponents point to, especially after the war?
Well, the primary piece of evidence, the one you always hear, is the immediate regional collapse that happened right after the 1975 communist takeover of Vietnam.
So the argument is, see, we told you so.
Pretty much. They argue this was the ultimate validation, that the threat was absolutely real. In quick succession, after Saigon fell in April 75, communist regimes took power in 3 countries.
Right. South Vietnam falls to the Viet Cong and is unified under Hanoi.
Laos falls to the Pathet Lao. And Cambodia falls under the unbelievably brutal rule of the Khmer Rouge.
It looked exactly like the prediction.
To anyone who believed in the theory, this sequence looked exactly like 3 dominoes falling in quick, unstoppable succession.
And it wasn't just that they all became communist regimes. The history shows they were materially connected, right?
Oh, absolutely. The historical record is crystal clear on that. There's a clear pattern of interconnectedness and material support. China and the Soviet Union were pumping massive amounts of aid and weapons into North Vietnam. And then Hanoi, in turn, supported the Pathet Lao and the Khmer Rouge, who themselves were originally part of the whole Viet Minh network. So that physical support gave real credence to the idea of a coordinated, contagious effect that the U.S. was trying to stop.
Okay, so beyond that immediate collapse, there's the buying time argument. This is the one championed by people like Walt Whitman Rostow and famously Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew.
This is a really crucial, more nuanced argument. It suggests that even though the intervention failed locally in Vietnam, it may have succeeded strategically in the long run.
How so?
Rostow and Yew argued that the long, drawn-out U.S. intervention, it lasted about 15 years, bought critical time for the other nations in the region, the ASEAN nations.
And what were those countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia? What were they doing with that time?
They were using it to consolidate their fragile new governments, to achieve economic growth, and to build up internal resilience against communist subversion. So while the U.S. was bleeding in Vietnam, these other nations were intensely focused on industrialization and establishing stable anti-communist political systems.
So the real defense against the dominoes was economic strength, not just military force.
That's exactly it. And Lee Kuan Yew's arguments on this are just brilliant. In 1975, right after Saigon fell, he met with President Ford and Kissinger, and he pleaded with them not to cut off imports from Southeast Asia.
What was his reasoning?
His statement was stark. He said, "We have to have the jobs if we are to stop communism. If we stop this trade process, it will do more harm than you can ever repair with aid."
The idea being, give us jobs, and we'll build economies that are immune to the appeal of communism.
Precisely. And this buying time idea is also seen in containment successes elsewhere in the region, while the U.S. was bogged down in Indochina. Proponents point out that communist insurgencies stalled or failed in other critical areas during this period.
Like the Malayan Emergency.
Or the Hukbalahap Rebellion in the Philippines, and the successful prevention of a communist coup in Indonesia in 1965. The argument is that these failures were partly because the pressure was concentrated on Vietnam, which allowed everyone else to get their houses in order.
And then there's the broadest possible view that the entire costly effort of containment driven by this domino fear ultimately led to the end of the Cold War.
Right. In this view, preventing all these successive regional losses, even at the immense cost of Vietnam, created the conditions for the Soviet Union to eventually collapse from within. That the decades-long struggle just exhausted the Soviet system. So the long-term historical vindication, they argue, is the peaceful end of the Cold War itself.
It's a compelling argument, a costly one, but compelling. But now let's turn to the critics. Was the domino theory just a catastrophic mistake, driven by paranoia?
Well, the earliest and you could argue the most sophisticated criticism actually came from inside the U.S. intelligence community. We have this highly critical memo from June 1964 from the CIA's Board of National Estimates to the director, John McCone.
And what did the CIA's own analysts think?
They were extremely skeptical of that inevitable rapid collapse model. They explicitly discounted the idea of rapid successive communization if Vietnam fell.
So they didn't see it as a chain reaction?
Not a rapid one, no. Their analysis concluded that the psychological impact would be significant, sure, but not instantly catastrophic. They didn't see a physical shockwave passing from one nation to the next, as the image suggests.
So what did they predict would happen instead?
They predicted a simultaneous direct effect on all Far Eastern countries that would look more like increased anti-Americanism and a growing belief that the U.S. was weak. But crucially, they believed any resulting spread of communism would be slow.
Which would give the U.S. time to adapt and respond.
Exactly. They saw local nationalism as a powerful counterforce to monolithic communism. They even suggested that a U.S. withdrawal might lead to friction between Hanoi, Beijing, and Moscow, which would actually be unfavorable to the communist cause. They saw a complex political shift, not an inevitable chain reaction.
And then, decades later, you get that famous, almost agonizing public retraction from one of the war's chief architects, Robert McNamara.
Yeah. McNamara, who was a huge proponent of the theory while he was Secretary of Defense, publicly states in his 1995 memoir that he believed the entire premise was wrong.
His words were pretty blunt.
Incredibly blunt. He said, "I think we were wrong. I do not believe that Vietnam was that important to the communists. I don't believe that its loss didn't lead to communist control of Asia."
That is a staggering admission. It just undermines the entire justification for the war. But how credible is that coming decades after the fact?
Well, it carries immense moral weight, even if critics point out it's a bit late. But it reflects the ultimate historical reality. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia fell, but the bigger dominoes, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, they didn't fall. The dominoes stopped at the border of Indochina.
Then you have to consider the local perspective, the view from Vietnam itself, which often just dismisses the U.S. intervention as unjustifiable.
Right. Academics like Professor Tran Chung Ngoc have argued that the intervention was unjust because Vietnam was just a small, poor, undeveloped country. It was completely incapable of harming a superpower like America. From that viewpoint, the war wasn't self-defense against global contagion. It was just a powerful nation using power over justice to impose his will.
And finally, there's the really influential critical perspective from Noam Chomsky, the threat of a good example. This turns the whole logic on its head.
Chomsky actually agreed that the fear policymakers had was roughly accurate, but he profoundly disagreed with the reason for that fear.
So what was his argument?
He argued the U.S. suppressed these popular movements not because they were Soviet puppets, but because successful socialist or communist movements, even in small, poor countries, could provide a dangerous, positive example.
Dangerous because success would breed emulation, not invasion.
Exactly. The real ideological danger, Chomsky argued, was successful self-development outside the Western capitalist model. If a small country like Grenada or Chile or Vietnam could achieve stability and improve life for its citizens on its own terms,
then wealthier neighbors would look at their own poor populations and ask, why not us?
Right. So the goal of the intervention wasn't to stop Moscow. It was to crush the successful model before it could inspire anyone else. As Chomsky put it, the weaker and poorer a country is, the more dangerous it is, as an example. The U.S. had to intervene to destroy the evidence that another path was even possible.
So the theory was born in the Cold War, focused on communism in Asia. But it's clear the framework itself, this idea of a contagious wave of political change, is endlessly adaptable.
Oh, completely. Historians have debated whether it failed regionally but maybe succeeded globally, or whether the mechanism applies to non-communist forces entirely.
Let's start with that idea of a global wave in the 1970s. This is the argument from Michael Lind.
Right. Lind argued that even though the regional dominoes right next to Vietnam, Japan, the Philippines didn't fall, the psychological success of the revolution fueled a wave of similar events all across the globe.
What did that look like?
In the 1970s, you saw regimes identifying as communist or socialist come to power in a staggering number of diverse countries. You're talking Benin, Ethiopia, Angola, Mozambique, Afghanistan, Grenada, and Nicaragua.
So this relies on that prestige interpretation. The success of one revolution gives morale to others.
Exactly. The victory in Vietnam gave global revolutionary movements this immense psychological momentum. They saw that a small, determined movement could actually defeat a superpower, and that fueled their confidence. It suggests that theory might have been geographically misapplied in the 60s, but correct about the global political contagion of a successful revolution.
And this is a perspective that was mirrored by the communist bloc itself. Che Guevara used this exact language.
He did. Che's 1967 essay, The Message to the Tricontinental, is a perfect example of the revolutionaries adopting the same psychological model.
The call for 2, 3, Many Vietnams.
That's the one. He was actively encouraging the idea that the success of the struggle in one place had to be replicated everywhere else to stretch U.S. resources and prestige to the breaking point. Both sides, revolutionary and conservative, believed in the power of the successful example.
On the flip side, you have the historian Max Boot. He argued that the U.S. defeat encouraged aggression not because of ideological inspiration, but because it signaled an erosion of American power.
And you could really feel that erosion in the late 1970s. U.S. enemies seized power all over the place. You had new socialist regimes in Africa, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iran hostage crisis.
It looked like a power vacuum.
It did. Boots suggests the political defeat of a superpower encouraged acts of aggression that enemies might otherwise have avoided. The failure of containment in one theater just signaled weakness and encouraged expansion everywhere else.
Let's look at some of the non-regional applications of the theory during the Cold War. It wasn't just a Southeast Asian thing.
Not at all. The metaphor was incredibly flexible. Richard Nixon and Kissinger famously used it to defend their destabilization of the democratically elected socialist government in Chile in the early 70s.
What was the geographic fear there? A domino effect in South America.
They feared what they called a red sandwich. The idea was that a communist Chile, combined with Castro's Cuba, would physically and ideologically entrap the rest of Latin America between them. The geography changes, the nations change, but that deep fear of sequential collapse remains the core justification.
And the Reagan administration brought it back in the 1980s.
Oh, absolutely. The domino theory was explicitly used to justify Reagan's policies in Central America and the Caribbean, especially supporting counterinsurgencies in El Salvador and Nicaragua. The argument was always the same. If one country falls, the whole region will be destabilized and threaten the U.S. southern border.
We even see it applied in the context of African decolonization from the perspective of white minority regimes.
That's right. The former Rhodesian Prime Minister, Ian Smith, explicitly described the rise of left-wing governments in sub-Saharan Africa as the communists' domino tactic. He would list them off: Tanzania, Zambia, Angola, Mozambique, and eventually Rhodesia itself, which became Zimbabwe. He saw it all as the insidious encroachment of Soviet imperialism marching down the continent.
And there's a darker, more tangential application with the rise of left-wing terrorism in Western Europe.
Yeah, you can look at these non-state actors. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had groups like the Red Brigades in Italy or the Red Army faction in West Germany. They were ideologically aligned with and often funded or backed by communist governments or their proxies. It suggested a kind of networked terrorist domino effect that crossed borders even if the states themselves stayed capitalist.
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating for me. When we shift from the Cold War to modern reverse domino theories, the metaphor itself seems to have become a permanent fixture in geopolitics, totally separate from ideology.
It's completely portable. After the Cold War, the metaphor started being used to describe positive change, not negative. After 2003, during the Iraq War, you had some foreign policy analysts, especially neoconservatives, arguing for a democratic domino theory.
A reverse domino theory.
Exactly. The idea was that if you could establish a successful, stable democracy in Iraq, it would inspire this cascade of liberalism and democracy across the whole Middle East.
A positive contagion from a Western perspective.
A wave of reform and pro-Western alignment. The problem, of course, was that the cascade never happened. In fact, you could argue the instability from the invasion led to a very different kind of regional contagion.
But on the other side of that coin, authoritarian leaders today have their own version of the domino fear.
They absolutely do. That's Vladimir Putin's analysis of the post-Soviet pro-democratic movements, the so-called color revolutions. It is hardened into his own domino theory of color revolutions, and you can find it written into Russian military doctrine.
So he sees these grassroots pro-democratic movements in places like Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan. He sees them as a contagious threat.
A strategically targeted contagious threat. Putin's doctrine views these protests as a tool used by the West to destabilize authoritarian states on Russia's border. And because they're seen as contagious and a direct threat to the stability of his own government, they demand preemptive, defensive action.
It's the authoritarian inverse of the original U.S. theory.
It is. And that brings us right up to today, to contemporary geopolitics, where the theory is used to explain Russian military interventions, specifically the war in Ukraine.
This is maybe the clearest modern echo of the whole thing.
It really is. For Ukraine's neighbors, especially Poland and the Baltic states, the war is a definitive test of the domino principle. Their core fear, Their narrative is a perfect iteration of the U.S. domino theory from 50 years ago. If Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, we will be next. The underlying psychological model of inescapable sequential collapse, it remains the primary motivation for defense.
So, after all that, what does it all mean? We've traced this theory from Truman's containment doctrine all the way to Putin's defensive playbook. It is clearly so much more than a historical footnote. If you had to synthesize the two major, lasting strategic takeaways from this whole concept, what would they be?
Okay, the first major takeaway has to be that the domino theory was, above everything else, a politically potent justification for the core U.S. policy of containment.
It was the public relations campaign for containment.
You could say that. It functioned as the perfect psychological imperative. It allowed administrations to commit these massive, long-term military and financial resources so far from home, all under the banner of preventing an otherwise inevitable global disaster.
It turned an optional foreign intervention into an existential necessity. What's the second takeaway? You mentioned Victor Chi's work on Asian alliances.
Right. This deals with the unexpected strategic structure the U.S. built to manage the domino threat. It's the complex mechanism of the asymmetrical bilateral alliances the U.S. set up with countries like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan.
And these were designed not just to contain communism, but to constrain the allies themselves. That's a powerful idea.
It is. The U.S. intentionally created these very tightly controlled bilateral alliances, rather than a big NATO-like structure in Asia, specifically to foster dependency on Washington.
And that dependency served two purposes.
Two strategic purposes, both related to the domino idea. First, it ensured they would comply with U.S. Cold War policy. But second, and just as important, it severely restricted their ability to use force or engage in what was called adventurous behavior.
So the U.S. was managing the risk that an aggressive move by, say, South Korea or Taiwan might accidentally start a bigger war.
And create a whole new unintended domino effect that would drag the U.S. into a massive conflict.
Exactly.
That really shifts the focus. The theory wasn't just about what the Soviets were doing, it was about managing risk within the American alliance system itself.
It underscores that critical relationship between a microcause, a political change in one small country, and the fear of a macro consequence long-term repercussions for an entire region or even the world. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. The domino theory is a psychological model of contagious political collapse or reform. The original context was communism, but that fair template is timeless. It addresses that deep human fear of losing control. So the question is, what modern global events, beyond geopolitics, are currently being framed by governments or the media using this exact same model?
I mean, think about the spread of an economic crisis, where the failure of one bank is feared to guarantee the collapse of global markets. Or the rapid, contagious rise of populist movements, where the success of one nationalist leader immediately validates the tactics of another somewhere else.
The concept of the falling dominoes, where one event seals the fate of all the others.
It remains the most compelling, the most frightening, and historically the most consequential way we frame disaster and demand immediate, total intervention.
Food for thought indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history and the enduring legacy of the domino theory. We'll see you next time.
Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today is on one of the most defining and, well, certainly one of the most contentious geopolitical frameworks of the Cold War, the domino theory. This concept, which guided U.S. foreign policy from, the early 1950s well into the 1980s, posited a kind of terrifying inevitability that if one nation succumbed to communism, its neighbors would inevitably fall in a cascading knock-on effect. It was really the intellectual foundation for successive U.S. administrations justifying vast military and economic intervention across the globe.
Indeed. And the stakes just couldn't have been higher. The material makes it clear that this theory translated a kind of abstract fear into concrete doctrine.
Absolutely. So the central question before us is a critical one. Was the domino theory a fundamentally accurate and, I'd say, valid strategic framework that successfully guided containment policy, or was it, as critics allege, a flawed, overly deterministic rationale that grossly exaggerated the threat, leading to unnecessary and often disastrous military interventions? I'll be arguing that the theory was strategically valid. that it successfully illuminated the global nature of the conflict, and the containment efforts based on it were essential.
And I'll be maintaining the opposing view. I would argue that the domino theory was, at its core, a strategic mistake rooted in a conceptual overreach. It functioned much more effectively as a powerful political metaphor used to mobilize public support and congressional funding than as a precise geopolitical law. We have to acknowledge that this framework ultimately failed to account for local complexities, and that its flaws were recognized and later openly confessed by the key policymakers who had once championed it.
The strategic utility of the domino theory, I think, rests on recognizing the genuine, coordinated, and expansive nature of the ideological challenge that communism posed. When President Dwight D. Eisenhower first articulated this threat back in 1954, he wasn't speaking merely of, political flags changing. He was speaking of the economic and strategic consequences of systematic loss. He warned of knocking over the first domino, which would guarantee the last one will go over very quickly, leading to profound influences. For Eisenhower, this was rooted in tangible fears, namely the potential loss of vital resources like tin and tungsten from Southeast Asia. So the theory was, in that sense, a necessary economic and resource security calculation. The evidence for it is strongest when we look at the specific outcomes in Southeast Asia in 1975. After the fall of South Vietnam, what followed was precisely the regional cascade predicted. Laos fell for the Pathet Lao, and Cambodia fell to the brutal Khmer Rouge. This shows the immediate knock-on effect, but maybe more compelling is the success of preventative containment. Figures like Walt Whitman Rostow and, crucially, Lee Kuan Yew have long argued that the U.S. intervention in Indochina, however painful, bought surrounding nations crucial time, specifically the ASEAN countries. This intervention, it shifted the regional military calculus, allowing countries like Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore to focus on their own internal development rather than immediate existential defense. The strategy worked by interrupting a larger chain reaction.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the outcome in three very closely linked Indo-Chinese states validates the theory as some universal strategic necessity, especially not when you consider the massive strategic costs the U.S. incurred. While I acknowledge the theory's prominence, the material confirms it was the primary rationale used by presidents across the board, its intellectual foundations were significantly weaker than its political momentum. Crucially, the inevitability that Eisenhower predicted was being challenged internally by intelligence analysts at the very time the policy was being cemented. I draw on the June 1964 CIA Board of National Estimates memorandum. This high-level internal document generally discounted the idea of a rapid successive communization of the Far East. The memo stated explicitly that any spread would take time, depend on localized politics, and was absolutely not inexorable. The intelligence community itself rejected the conceptual rigidity. And then we saw that high-level skepticism eventually morph into a public acknowledgement of strategic error. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a key architect of the Vietnam escalation, stated in 1995 that he believed the domino theory was a mistake. He argued that Vietnam's loss didn't lead to communist control of Asia. This suggests the theory was less a valid forecast and more of an exaggerated rationale for the expansive use of military power.
The challenge I have with dismissing the theory based on, let's say, retrospective judgment or internal memos is that it seems to ignore the concrete, observed reality of that coordinated ideological transfer. I see why you emphasize intelligent skepticism, but how do we then account for the specific actions observed in the region? The regional cascade of 1975 provides hard evidence that the ideological transfer mechanism was real. It wasn't just internal revolution. The fact that communist governments supplied aid to neighboring revolutionaries, China and the USSR supplying North Vietnam, and then Hanoi actively supporting the Pathet Lao in Laos and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, that demonstrates the coordinated export of revolution. That's central to the theory's premise. The Pathet Lao and Khmer Rouge were historically linked to the earlier Viet Minh movement, so the disintegration of the region was precisely what Eisenhower had warned of.
That's a compelling point regarding regional coordination, And I do concede the historical links within the former French Indochina sphere are undeniable. However, what that outcome proves is geographic proximity and coordinated action among closely linked movements, not an inevitable global principle. It really narrows the theory's strategic scope quite a bit. If the theory were truly this inexorable geopolitical law, a successful South Vietnam takeover should have triggered communist successes across the entire continent, not just in the two nations bordering it. But the source material demonstrates that this, well, it simply did not happen. During the peak of the conflict in Vietnam, earlier, aggressive communist campaigns in other key Southeast Asian nations failed. I'm referring specifically to the Malayan Emergency, where communist insurgents were defeated, and the Hukbala Hop Rebellion in the Philippines, a large communist-led peasant movement which was also suppressed. The existence of these concurrent but ultimately unsuccessful movements strongly suggests that localized factors, strong governmental resilience and specific counterinsurgency efforts, were far more decisive than some supposed domino force emanating from Hanoi. The chain reaction was interruptible. It wasn't inevitable, not outside that immediate geographical and historical cluster. And let's transition from predictive accuracy to the actual function of the theory within U.S. policy, which is arguably even more revealing of its flaws. The material suggests the theory led the U.S. to prioritize controlling its allies just as much as containing its enemies. This shifts the focus from external defense to internal management. Victor Cha's analysis highlights that the U.S. deliberately constructed these asymmetrical bilateral alliances with countries like Taiwan and South Korea. These weren't just simple defense pacts. They were designed specifically to constrain potential rogue alliances and foster political dependency. The fear, which was driven by this domino theory mindset, was that instability from an ally could trigger a conflict the U.S. didn't want, thereby opening a door for communist influence. So the theory, in a way, became an instrument of U.S. control, managing the internal political behavior of allies rather than being a purely defensive framework.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because that control you describe wasn't a flaw. It was a necessary component of effective containment in a world defined by ideological war. Instability, or as you put it, adventurous behavior in any allied nation could have destabilized the regional balance and provided the precise opportunity for communist infiltration, triggering the very domino effect we were trying to prevent. We have to remember the ideological danger was not always purely military. The most potent threat was often the ideological success of non-capitalist development models. I think Noam Chomsky's perspective on the threat of a good example is highly pertinent here. He argued that communist or socialist movements often brought significant economic improvements or land reforms to poorer countries. The success of these non-capitalist models, the good example, was inherently dangerous because it threatened to discredit the capitalist US-backed model. If Vietnam or Cuba could succeed outside the Western sphere, the prestige of that success could politically inspire revolution elsewhere. This confirms the premise of political spread through prestige, which explains precisely why the U.S. felt the need to suppress these so-called people's movements in places like Grenada and Nicaragua.
That framing of the ideological threat is powerful, but it actually strengthens my argument against the rigid strategic validity of the original domino theory. If the true threat was ideological prestige and economic success, this good example, then why did U.S. policy continually rely on massive military intervention? That was the justification provided by the falling dominoes metaphor. McNamara admitted the war in Vietnam was a mistake, precisely because the strategic importance of the country couldn't be quantified by that metaphor. The material shows we were responding to complex, localized national liberation movements with a blunt, universal instrument justified by the rhetoric of inevitable rapid collapse.
Well, the evidence of the theory's fundamental strategic insight lies in its sheer durability and the constant reapplication of the concept itself. That proves it accurately names a genuine phenomenon of ideological diffusion. Michael Lind noted that even if the Asian domino effect was limited, the theory's spirit was vindicated by the global wave of socialist regimes rising in the 1970s. In Africa, for instance, in Angola and Mozambique, and later in Latin America with Nicaragua. This global application demonstrates that the phenomenon of political contagion, where success in one area inspires and empowers movements elsewhere, is real. Moreover, the concept endures today. It's applied globally in non-communist context, like the reverse domino theory for the spread of democracy, or even in contemporary analysis of Russian influence in color revolutions. A concept that remains this useful must reflect a genuine pattern of political diffusion, not just some historical anomaly.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that its constant reapplication simply proves it is a powerful political metaphor? A brilliant, evocative piece of rhetoric used continuously to justify expansive and expensive foreign policy, rather than a precise geopolitical law. We have to distinguish between a metaphor that gives political leaders a clear reason for intervention and an accurate strategic forecast. If the CIA's own Board of National Estimates in 1964 specifically stated the spread would not be rapid or inexorable, and if the very policymakers who used the phrase later recanted, then its original Cold War formulation just lacks analytical rigor. Its longevity speaks not to its validity as a rigid doctrine, but to its remarkable utility as a political tool for simplifying complexity and mobilizing resources.
To summarize my position, the evidence demonstrates that the domino theory was a necessary and, I would say, largely accurate framework for understanding the profound and coordinated nature of ideological conflict in the Cold War. It correctly predicted the regional cascade in Indochina, and more importantly, it provided the intellectual justification for robust containment strategies that, according to proponents like Lee Kuan Yew, ultimately succeeded in limiting the expansion of communism to a specific regional cluster. It was a framework that anticipated macro consequences and led to preventative action that paid strategic dividends.
And to summarize my view, the theory remains incredibly significant because it so profoundly shaped U.S. Cold War policy, but its predictive power was demonstrably weak, conceptually rigid, and exaggerated. Its core conceptual flaws, the belief that political changes were rapid, inevitable, and universally contagious, were identified early on by internal analysts and confirmed later by historical reassessments of those involved. So understanding the material requires acknowledging both its powerful influence on policy justification and its ultimate inaccuracy as a rigid, universal law of geopolitics.
What our discussion highlights, I think, is the enduring challenge inherent in formulating effective doctrine, choosing between anticipating the worst case, profound influences scenario, the necessary fear of what might happen, and accurately assessing the complex, local, and often resilient realities on the ground which may defy any rigid prediction.
Exactly. The history of the domino theory really shows how easily fear and political rhetoric can conflate potential threats with geopolitical inevitability. And that's a vital distinction that must always be maintained when we evaluate strategic frameworks today.